This is Mark I, the world's first electromagnetic computer, 51 feet long, 5 tons of relays and gears. No screen, no software, not even a keyboard. But in 1944, this machine changed the course of history when it became the brains of the US Navy. For over 3 months, Mark I ran the calculations behind the most powerful weapon ever created. The weapon that ended wars.
Beneath that sinister pall of smoke, the world's most destructive force has been unleashed. With what results we know only too well.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
But behind the precision of the Manhattan Project, there was a woman who taught Mark I how to speak. We are talking about Grace Hopper. She built the first compiler ever created, she wrote the first manual for Mark I, and she became one of the first female Rear Admirals in the US Navy. Hopper was so ahead of her time that people called her the Queen of Code. And this is her story. Curiosity is the wick in the candle of learning, and for Grace Hopper, that wick was lit early. At the age of 7, while most kids broke toys, Grace took apart 7 clocks just to see how they worked. Her mother, a mathematician herself, didn't punish her. Instead, she nurtured Grace's curiosity. This small moment was not just a childhood mischief, it was a sign of who Grace would become. Born in 1906 into a wealthy New York family, Grace seemed to have it all: money, luxury, and freedom. But that didn't make life easy, because when you're a tiny rebel in a world that tells you to sit still, freedom can feel like isolation. While other girls memorized etiquette, Grace was racing boys, climbing trees, and joining competitive sports like basketball, hockey, and water polo. One summer at Lake Wentworth, Grace and her cousins were caught climbing a tall pine tree. Since she was at the very top, it was clear who had led the charge. As a punishment, she lost her swimming privileges for a week, but that never stopped her. Grace didn't want dolls or dresses, she wanted to explore. Her idols weren't princesses, they were engineers, sailors, and soldiers. Her maternal grandfather, a civil engineer in New York, often took her on surveying trips. This planted the seeds of science and problem-solving in her young mind. And her great-grandfather, Admiral Alexander Wilson Russell, had served in the Civil War. His legacy shaped her sense of strength and service. Once, during a solo sail at Lake Wentworth, a sudden gust of wind flipped her boat. Her mother, watching from the porch, simply picked up the megaphone and shouted, "Remember your great-grandfather, the Admiral." With that, Grace kicked her way back to shore. So, from her childhood, she was born in an environment of courage and daring. But curiosity and courage alone weren't enough. If Grace was going to understand how the world worked, she needed to channel her curiosity at the right place. When she was 16, she applied to Vassar College. At that time, Vassar was a prestigious and highly ranked college which was known for its lab and research facility. It was also one of the top 7 sister colleges at the time, which meant very few students were able to join it. It seemed like the perfect place for someone like her. But when she attempted the exam, her dream shattered. She met all the admission requirements, except for Latin. Grace had always been drawn to logic, mathematics, problem-solving, and the mechanics of how things worked. But when it came to grammar and language, especially Latin, her interest faded. It wasn't that she lacked intelligence, it just wasn't where her passion lived, and that disinterest cost her. Latin was a mandatory subject, and her poor performance in it led to her rejection from Vassar. A single subject, one she didn't even care for, stood between her and her dream. But Grace didn't fall apart. She recalibrated. Instead of giving up, she enrolled at Hartridge School, a small prep school in New Jersey. For a year, she studied and worked harder than ever before. And by the next admission cycle, she returned to Vassar's gates. This time, not with crossed fingers, but with the credentials to claim what was hers. Vassar became her playground of ideas. She questioned every formula, every principle, until she finally understood them. Her professors would find her in classrooms long after others had left, staring at a blackboard, refusing to move until the pieces clicked into place. She once said, "I always made the connection between theory and reality. That's the way you explain things." By 1928, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in mathematics and physics, and left with more than just a diploma. She was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, the oldest academic honor society in the country, and Vassar, recognizing her brilliance, awarded her a fellowship to continue her studies. She chose Yale. There, surrounded by men who believed computing was not for women, she pursued a master's in mathematics. She was one of the only women in the program, outnumbered, underestimated, and overlooked. But again, Grace did what Grace always did. She proved them wrong by completing her master's in 1930. The little girl who once dismantled alarm clocks had now cracked open the doors of some of the most elite academic institutions in America. And yet, Grace was only getting started. In 1930, Grace Brewster Murray finally became Grace Hopper. She had just married Vincent Foster Hopper, a quiet, thoughtful professor from New York University. Together, they boarded a ship bound for Europe with her entire family. The Hoppers weren't typical newlyweds. Their trip to Europe wasn't just a romantic honeymoon, it was more like an adventure. They visited France, Scotland, Wales, and England. One place that stood out to Grace more than any other was Stonehenge. Those ancient stones, precise, massive, built with a purpose nobody fully understood, spoke to her. A puzzle of the past, standing defiantly in the present, just like her. It left a deep impression on her and later became her favorite monument. But married life for Grace didn't mean settling down, not even close. This was the Great Depression, a time when jobs vanished, banks crumbled, and entire families slipped into poverty overnight. Yet in this uncertainty, Grace got a teaching job at Vassar College for just $800 a year. But for her, it wasn't about the paycheck. It was about the purpose and impact she can create. Even during her student years, she had been the go-to tutor. Once a professor asked Grace to help a struggling classmate in physics. Under her guidance, the student's grade climbed from a D to a passing C, a quiet but powerful signal of her teaching ability. But as always, Grace wasn't content with just teaching. She wanted more. So she continued her academic journey with a bigger challenge, a PhD at Yale. She balanced two demanding roles at once. On weekdays, she taught math to young women at Vassar. On weekends, she traveled to Yale, studying hard and working through complex problems that most people wouldn't even try to solve. This schedule kept her away from home for long periods, which even affected her marriage. But in 1934, that double life paid off. Grace Hopper earned her doctorate in mathematics from Yale University, one of the rarest academic honors for a woman at the time. In the 3 years following Grace's graduation, Yale awarded only 7 PhDs in mathematics. Even when Grace was working on her doctorate, there were less than 10 doctoral students in mathematics at Yale, and only 4 of them were women. By the late 1930s, she was no longer just a professor. She was a pillar of the Vassar math department. She had the life so many dreamed of: a stable job, academic prestige, a quiet home. But stability never satisfied her. At the time, coding wasn't even a concept. Computers, as we know them, were still science fiction. But soon, everything changed.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
When the world is on fire, some run to safety, others run toward the flames. And when tragedy struck, Hopper opted for the flame. The bombing of Pearl Harbor shook the entire nation. Within days, thousands enlisted, young men stormed the recruiting stations, factories roared back to life, patriotism surged like a tide. But for Grace, it was not just flags and slogans. Her great-grandfather had commanded ships in the Civil War. Her family tree was rooted in service, honor, and the sea. And though she spent her life chasing numbers and formulas, something inside her wanted to do more. To apply that knowledge not just in theory, but in action. She was 36, a tenured professor at Vassar, secure, respected, and already holding a PhD. And yet, she walked away from it all. Because for Grace, freedom mattered more than stability. Most people her age were settling into domestic life, but she wanted to free herself and live a life of curiosity, innovation, and courage. So she enrolled in the US Navy. But the Navy didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. They said she was too old, too thin, and too late. But for her, it wasn't a roadblock, just a problem. And problems always had solutions. She kept applying. She leaned on her family's naval legacy and argued that her math could help win the war. And finally, in 1943, Grace was accepted in the U.S. Naval Reserve, joining WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. The next step was boot camp, a crash course at Smith College's Midshipmen's School. In a class of sharp, ambitious women, Grace graduated at the top of her unit, and within weeks, she was sent not to sea, but to something equally uncharted. A basement filled with wires, spinning reels, and an enormous machine. The Harvard Computation Lab. There, she met Rear Admiral Howard Aiken, an ex-Harvard professor and a legend who designed the Harvard Mark I. It stretched 51 feet long, powered by electromechanical relays, and made more noise than sense to a new person. Aiken introduced it with 5 simple words, saying, "That is a computing machine." To anyone else, it might have looked like a mechanical beast, but to Grace, a giant alarm clock waiting to be taken apart. Her formal education hadn't prepared her for this, but she believed that you don't have to know everything, you just need to know where to find it. So she taught herself. She stayed late, read the blueprints, and learned how to translate military questions into mathematical language, instructions the Mark I could execute. And soon, she wasn't just learning the machine, she was commanding it. She was always busy with the Mark I, solving urgent problems, whether it was plotting rocket trajectories, creating range tables for new anti-aircraft guns, or calculating torpedo designs.
It was also used for ballistics calculation. It was used for some of the early calculations in the Manhattan Project, in the design of the atomic bomb.
Hopper's days were spent punching sequences of instructions into paper tape and feeding them into the machine, then watching as the Mark I typed out answers on its output printer. And that's how the war effort moved forward, one calculation at a time. One day in 1945, while working with the Mark II, the machine suddenly stopped. Hopper and her team tried everything to make it work again, but the problem seemed unsolvable. When they decided to open it, there was a moth stuck in the relay. They taped the bug into the logbook with the note, "First actual case of bug being found." So they were the ones who popularized debugging as a term in the programming world.
And I think it's rather nice that the Navy is keeping a few of the early artifacts, like the first bug and me and a few other things.
Despite being one of the only women in a male-dominated lab, Hopper earned the respect of her colleagues and the admiration of Aiken. Impressed by her attention to detail and ability to explain complex systems, he gave her a massive task of writing the operation manual for the Mark I.
One day, Commander Aiken came around to my desk and says, "You're going to write a book." I said, "I can't write a book." He said, "You're in the Navy now." So I wrote a book.
Each night, she would read her writing aloud to Aiken. If she stumbled over a sentence, she made herself rewrite it, forcing her to develop a style of clarity and simplicity that would define her life. The final product: a 561-page guide called A Manual of Operation for the Automatic Sequence Controlled Calculator. It not only explained how to use the machine, it also included a history of computing, from Blaise Pascal to Charles Babbage, showcasing Hopper's deep respect for the pioneers who came before her. By the end of the war, Lieutenant Hopper had become one of the first true computer programmers. Under her influence, Mark I became more flexible, more dynamic, and more capable. It could switch tasks just by feeding the new instructions rather than being rebuilt every time. This made it useful not just for military calculations, but for businesses, governments, and everyday practical needs. The war was finished, but victory came with a cost. In 1946, the Navy asked her to return to civilian life. Despite her service, despite her genius, she was denied a full commission. She was 40. She had helped win a war, but now her age was a disqualifier.
So naturally, I applied for transfer to the regular Navy. And I was turned down because I was too old. The cutoff age was 38 and I was 40.
But rules were rules, so she didn't protest. She joined the Naval Reserve and moved on. Around the same time, her marriage to Vincent Hopper quietly came to an end. After 15 years together, they parted ways. Grace kept his last name and was starting over, alone, uncertain, and standing at a crossroads. Vassar offered her a full professorship. It was comfortable, respectable, and safe. But she turned it down. Instead, she walked into the unknown, into a world so new it barely existed. Electronic computing. No roadmap, no job titles, no guarantees. But that's what excited her. And this refusal to play it safe changed everything. The war was over, but Grace Hopper's mission had only just begun. In 1946, while the world was busy rebuilding cities and economies, Hopper returned to Harvard, not to teach, but to build the future. As a research fellow at the Computation Laboratory, she worked on refining the Mark II and Mark III computers under Navy contracts. These were early machines, enormous and temperamental, but to Grace, they were the beginning of something big. There was just one problem. Harvard didn't offer tenured positions to women. It didn't matter how brilliant you were, how historic your contributions were, there was always a ceiling, and Grace Hopper was never the kind to live under ceilings. So, once again, she walked away from academia. As she would later put it, "I've always been more interested in the future than in the past." And for her, the future wasn't at Harvard. It was somewhere entirely new. In 1949, she joined a small computer startup in Philadelphia, the Eckert-Mauchly Computer Corporation. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't secure, it wasn't even well-funded, but it was bold. And bold was exactly where Grace belonged. This small startup was behind the success of ENIAC, the first electronic digital computer for the Army, and now they were building something even more ambitious, UNIVAC-1, the first commercial computer designed for governments and corporations. To most people, it looked like a giant calculator. To Grace, it was a blank canvas. In the early 1950s, computers were still machines for specialists. Programming them meant memorizing endless strings of numbers and binary code. It was a world of switches, wires, and raw logic. Only a few could speak the machine's language. But Grace Hopper didn't think that was how it had to be. She believed people should have the freedom to tell computers what to do in plain English, not in strings of numbers. While working on the UNIVAC project, she led a team that made this possible. By helping computers understand more natural instructions, she gave humans the freedom to focus on thinking and decision-making, while computers handled the boring, repetitive tasks. And in 1952, she made that dream a reality.
She invented this A-to-O compiler, which basically changed everything. This is what she should be the most famous for and isn't, because compilers are really hard to explain to the public. Bugs are super easy.
The A0 compiler was a breakthrough. It translated English-like commands into machine code. Instead of programming with ones and zeros, you could now use terms like add or multiply. It was simple, elegant, and revolutionary. The compiler also introduced the idea of reusable code models, a concept that became foundational in modern programming. But not everyone was impressed. In fact, many in the tech world dismissed her idea entirely. They thought programming was too sacred, too complex to be simplified. Even Hopper recalled this many times. "I had a running compiler, and nobody would touch it. They told me computers could only do arithmetic. They could not do programs." But Grace didn't need their approval. She used to say,
So I want to tell something to all the young people here. On many, many, many occasions, you'll find it is much easier to apologize than it is to get permission. You do it. Then when somebody comes after you and says, "Are you supposed to do that?" "Oh, gee, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that."
she had already seen the future, a world where not only experts but also normal people could use computers to solve real problems. In 1953, she pushed the idea even further. In her spare time, Hopper began building something even more ambitious, a programming language that used everyday English. She called it Flowmatic. She didn't even dedicate full time to it. Flowmatic was something that lived in her mind for a long time, and she built it using spare moments between her meetings. She would make notes on napkins, sketch out syntax on the backs of envelopes, and refine ideas in the margins of her day. It wasn't just a language. It was a quiet revolution that would change the entire programming world. Instead of cryptic codes, someone could now write add salary to total pay, giving new total. It was the first time everyday words were used to communicate with a machine. And unlike previous systems built for scientists, Flowmatic was designed for real-world business tasks. It's much easier for most people to write an English statement than it is to use symbols. So I decided data processors ought to be able to write their programs in English, and the computers would translate them into machine code. In a world where most still believed computers were only for specialists, Hopper democratized the programming world, and the world finally caught up.
Grace Hopper is at the center of a revolution that is changing life as we know it. It tells the Navy how many tons of baked beans it has on hand. It targets its missiles. A revolution that can free human hands and that can solve, at least on paper, human problems in seconds where it used to take years.
In 1960, the U.S. Department of Defense assembled a team to create a standardized programming language for business. Grace Hopper was at the table, and the result was COBOL, the Common Business-Oriented Language, a direct descendant of Flowmatic.
She is more than just a superb mathematical talent. It was Grace Hopper who helped teach the machines a language, stopped them from speaking in undecipherable numbers, enabled them to speak in English or French or German or whatever language you choose.
So when she once said COBOL 60 is 95% phlegmatic, she wasn't exaggerating. COBOL would go on to dominate the world. By the 1970s, it powered banking systems, government records, payrolls, and insurance databases. Millions of lines of COBOL were written, not by computer scientists, but by ordinary people, the very people Grace had fought for. And even today, COBOL still runs some of the most critical infrastructure in the world. Even as her career in tech soared, Hopper never left the Navy behind. She kept her uniform pressed, her commission active, and by the mid-1960s, she had risen to the rank of commander in the Naval Reserve. But juggling two careers eventually took its toll. In 1966, at the age of 60, she was forced into retirement. She called it the saddest day of my life.
The second paragraph was aimed right at me personally. It said, "You have attained age 60," and I knew that too. And the third paragraph said, "Here are the blanks, please apply for retirement." So I did, and I was officially placed the saddest day of my life on the Naval Reserve retired list with the rank of commander on the 31st of December, 1966. Thanks to our highly automated pension system, I got my first pension check on the 1st of April.
But history had other plans, because when you're Grace Hopper, no retirement is forever. Grace Hopper's retirement from the Navy didn't last long. Just a few months after retirement, the Navy realized it could not afford to lose Grace Hopper's expertise. The Cold War was in full swing, and the military was undergoing a massive digital transformation. New systems, new machines, a new generation of coders who had no idea where their field had come from. The Navy needed help. But more than that, they needed Grace Hopper. So, in August 1967, they did something almost unheard of. They recalled a retired 60-year-old woman to active duty. Not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. Hopper was delighted to put the uniform back on. She often joked that she joined the Navy because she loved it, and now the Navy loved her back. Back in uniform, she was assigned to the Chief of Naval Operations Staff, leading the Navy Programming Languages Group, a position that gave her complete authority over how computers were used across the entire military. Her job was simple in theory, but monumental in practice: standardizing Navy software.
I've long advocated the use of the standard high-level languages. And I'd go to one of our data processing installations and say, "Why aren't you using standard COBOL instead of all those bells and whistles the vendor gives you?"
Modernizing its programming tools and training thousands of new programmers to handle increasingly complex systems. Most officers in her position would have led from behind a desk, but Grace didn't do anything halfway. She always said,
and I think he would further add, you manage things, you lead people. We need to bring that back very badly, not only in the armed forces, but in all of government, throughout business and industry. It's the one thing that those youngsters are really looking for: good, positive leadership.
And that's what she did. She led by her example. Younger sailors and officers were initially astonished by this white-haired lady in navy blues who could out-talk, out-think, and outwork all of them. She logged hundreds of thousands of miles visiting Navy bases, shipyards, and conferences worldwide, often flying overnight to deliver her trademark talks at 8 a.m. the next morning. Due to her energy and dedication, she quickly became known as Amazing Grace. She ran her team like a Navy vessel, precise, swift, and focused. But she also had a sense of humor. Her office famously featured a clock that ran counterclockwise.
I have another clock that has a pointer and the digits go around on a drum. It tells perfectly good time. Of course, by now I have a digital clock. And my helpful crew gave me an hourglass. But They sit there day in and day out and say, never, 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 in this office say, but we've always done it that way.
A visual reminder that just because it's always been done that way doesn't mean it's right. That phrase, "we've always done it that way," was her enemy. If she heard it, she'd cut it down without hesitation. Throughout the 1970s, Hopper's influence only grew. In 1973, she was promoted to captain, and later that year she became the first American woman to be named a Distinguished Fellow of the British Computer Society, a rare international honor and a sign that her impact had long since extended beyond the US military. With global recognition, she became a kind of goodwill ambassador for the Navy. The US Navy relied on her expertise for their technological growth. For them, she was like a bridge between the armed forces and the fast-moving world of computing. Hopper's gift for communication was also dynamic. She could talk to hard-nosed admirals in Pentagon briefing rooms or to rooms full of civilian computer experts with equal ease. And no matter who she was speaking to, whether a 4-star general or a first-year coder, she made them feel heard. She made them feel like they mattered. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan promoted her to Commodore, a title that was soon renamed Rear Admiral. And with that, Grace Hopper became one of the highest-ranking women in the history of the United States Navy. She was 76 years old, and still, she wasn't slowing down. By this time, she was the oldest active-duty commissioned officer in the entire US military. And she carried herself with the energy of someone half her age. Her mind was razor-sharp, her lectures were packed, and her devotion to mentorship became her legacy. She launched weekly programming seminars for junior officers. She personally reviewed their code line by line. Her door was always open. And to her, that was the most important part of her job. She once said, "If you ask me what accomplishments I'm most proud of, the answer would be all the young people I've trained over the years. That's more important than writing the first compiler." She was also known for her talent for explaining tough concepts in simple words. Perhaps the most iconic example was her explanation of a nanosecond.
So if you start the velocity of light and use your friendly computer, you discover that a nanosecond is 11.8 inches long. The maximum limiting distance that electricity can travel in a billionth of a second. I hope you'll all get some of these nanoseconds. I've got lots of them with me.
Finally, in August 1986, Rear Admiral Grace Hopper retired from the US Navy, and this time, it was the final one. She was 79 years old, having served 43 years from World War II through the height of the Cold War. At her retirement ceremony, she was awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combat honor the Department of Defense can bestow. And in her farewell, she said something that summed up her entire life.
I have already received the highest award I will ever receive, no matter how long I live, no matter how many more jobs I may have. And that has been the privilege and the responsibility of serving very proudly in the United States Navy.
Those words encapsulated how deeply service and duty ran in her veins. Even as she stepped down from active duty, she was not done. The very next year, in 1987, she accepted a new role as senior consultant at Digital Equipment Corporation. It wasn't a ceremonial position. It was hands-on. She advised engineers, trained staff, gave lectures, often traveling more in her 80s than people did in their 30s.
You're working a full day now for a private firm, right?
Yes, for Digital Equipment Corporation.
Digital Equipment?
Got to get that in there, good outfit.
Okay.
She believed that we're flooding people with information, we need to feed it through knowledge. And that's what she did, every single day, until the very end. Hopper spent her life changing not just technology, but also the way people viewed age, gender, and innovation. To recognize her contribution, President George H.W. Bush awarded her the National Medal of Technology in 1991. She was the first woman to receive it as an individual. By then, she had earned over 40 honorary degrees from universities around the world. On January 1st, 1992, Grace passed away at the age of 85 and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. In her honor, the U.S. Navy named a warship after her, the USS Hopper. In 2016, she was awarded with the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama, the highest civilian honor in the United States.
If Wright is flight and Edison is light, then Hopper is code. And she symbolizes that generation of unsung women who helped send humankind into space. Her software architecture echoes in countless technologies today, and her example speaks of the American spirit of discovery that exists in every little girl and little boy.
Today, her legacy lives on through the Grace Hopper Celebration, one of the world's largest gatherings of women in tech, and Grace Hopper College at Yale University. She once said, "The most dangerous phrase is, 'We've always done it this way.'" It was that refusal to accept limits that made Grace Hopper a legend in her field. And that's why she's remembered today as the mother of modern computing, a woman who defined the digital age. If you think Grace Hopper's story was crazy, check out our video on Tor, how a military experiment turned into the world's most powerful privacy tool. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.